Something that I found really interesting was not only was Intimate Apparel about this group of minorities trying to find their place in America and kind of defy stereotypes, it was also very much, I felt like, had a feminist approach, as it was seen as these women need to be more independent and stop putting their hopes and dreams in men because they'll never be truly satisfied unless they stick to themselves and don't let men come in and ruin them, as seen by Mamie, Esther, and Mrs. Van Buren, even Mrs. Dickinson to some point. Some of the values here are intimacy, as all these women look for this emotional intimacy in men and are constantly disappointed. Mrs. Van Buren finally thinks she finds it in Esther, but it can't work out because just their difference in society. Mamie thinks she finds it in Songbird, which is actually George, which can't work out because it's the husband of her friend Esther. And Esther thinks she finds it in George, but George is actually not a nice person at all. While Mr. Marks is who she wants to have it with, but can't due to his religion. Also, religion is very important, as it's Esther and Mr. Marks and Mrs. Dickinson are some of the more respectable characters who are all very religious, while George is, you like George while you think he's religious, and when you find out he's not, it's a very negative thing. Something I didn't understand was they talked about this corset they were having these ladies try on. I didn't really understand what that was, as it's not a part of today's fashion at all. But I realized it was at the time, it was the proper way to wear lingerie or be sexy at the time. So it makes sense that Esther is showing it. She's making intimate apparel. For the three R's, I feel like it reinforced the African American experience, at least at the time, as it's kind of assumed, I mean, that they wouldn't be very well off. They're all poor, they're all illiterate, and I think the stereotype, especially at the time, is reinforced in the case of George, as he's a uneducated poor man who is just not a very nice person at all. And even somewhat in Mamie, as she's a poor sex worker. But Esther has her own dreams, her own vision. She's just supporting the family. So that, I think, kind of reinvents it a little bit. And I definitely think Nottage is trying to show these stereotypes in a bad light, as she's obviously against it and wants them to break free, seen by Esther rejecting Mrs. Van Buren. Yes, stereotypes are still very present. Um, I think, I mean, the only way to truly get past the stereotype is to get to know someone in the minority group. Therefore, you know what they're really like and don't have to go off what society is telling you they're like. An example in the play is Esther and Mamie. There's this stereotype about sex workers, but Esther gets to know Mamie and see that there's this whole other side. Two questions: what happens to George? He just his wife, I mean, his wife's back at the boarding house and Mamie's not letting him in. Where does he go? He has no money. And another, will anything ever be able to happen between Esther and Mr. Marks? Probably not, but just wondering what your thoughts were.